Hello. Thanks for coming out. I very much appreciate it. I absolutely love being at Calvin College and absolutely love Matt and Susan, and it's really just a pleasure and an honor to be here with all of you. So want to thank all of the groups that co-sponsored, and thank you especially to Matt for organizing the talk, which will become sort of the signature presentation for what I'm doing now at both the Good Food Institute as well as New Crop Capital. So I want to start by polling the audience, and Matt insisted when he saw this slide that there's some sort of negative feeling at Calvin College about pasta, but I'm guessing that's not true. I think he was pulling my leg. Who here likes pasta? All right, we've got unanimity on pasta. That's awesome. Liar. Who here would go to your refrigerator, take out 9 plates of pasta, dump them in the trash, and eat 1 plate of pasta? Okay. Nobody here who is like anti-environment, you know? Bring on the end of the earth. Waste as much as I can. It's the rare person who raises their hand to the idea of, wasting vast quantities of food. And yet, I'm going to contend in the first half of this presentation that that's what the meat industry entails. So I'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment, but basically, this just makes intuitive sense. I weigh about 185 pounds. If I do nothing but lay in bed watching Jerry Springer reruns, I'm going to burn like 2,000 calories a day. Except when I get excited, Jerry! Then it ticks up a little bit, right? When I get excited, my adrenaline is pumping and my caloric needs go up. That same sort of relationship is true for all animals. Not that they spend time laying in bed watching bad television, but that the vast majority of what you feed to a chicken or a pig or a cow, the vast majority the animal expends simply existing. So that the most efficient meat, which is chicken, it takes 9 calories in the form of alfalfa or soy or wheat or corn. It takes 9 calories into a chicken to get 1 calorie back out in the form of food. So the big question in food technology and the big question in nonprofit circles that are looking at global hunger is how are we going to feed 9 billion people by the year 2050? And I'm going to contend that we're not going to do it with the vast inefficiency that's represented by animal agriculture. So that is just one of the problems of animal agriculture. I'm going to be speaking briefly about 4 of them, but it's a good segue into the basic theme of the talk, which is the future of protein, blending markets and food technology to serve some of the world's biggest problems. The 4 problems that are linked to food technology that I'm going to talk about, first, which we just got an introduction to, and that is global hunger. The second, which is a complement to the global hunger problem, and that is the environmental consequences of animal agriculture. The third is the human health consequences of consuming so many animal products. And the fourth is the intensification of animal agriculture, which leads to an awful lot of suffering for other animals. So the first point is global hunger. And this is actually, I adopted a vegan diet 28 years ago. And I adopted a vegan diet after I read a book called Diet for a Small Planet by Frances Moore Lappé. And in Diet for a Small Planet, she makes the point that I just made, that it is vastly inefficient to grow crops, to feed those crops to animals so that we can eat those animals. And that, in fact, it takes 9 calories in, 9 plates of pasta, essentially, to create 1 plate of pasta that's actually going to be consumed in terms of caloric intake. A number of years ago, the Food and Agricultural Organization came out with a report about where wheat and corn goes. And they found that 100 million metric tons of wheat and corn every year is turned into biofuels. The global envoy on food, this guy, his name is Jean Ziegler, he called it a crime against humanity. He said that we would take wheat and corn and put them into gas tanks while roughly 1 billion people are living in nutritional deficit. Nutritional deficit, it's a euphemism, right? It means they're starving. They're not taking in enough calories to sustain basic life functioning. He said it's a crime against humanity that we would take 100 million metric tons of corn and wheat and turn them into fuel while people are starving. Because, of course, it creates competition, right? If you're buying 100 million metric tons of corn and wheat and turning them into biofuels, that drives up the price of corn and wheat for the billion people who don't have anything to eat at all. So what do people think of that argument? Does that resonate with you, the idea that it's a crime against humanity to take 100 million metric tons of edible food and turn them into biofuels while people are starving? Raise your hand if that makes sense. Yeah, so for pretty much everybody that makes sense, 100 million metric tons. That same Food and Agriculture Organization report found that 756 million metric tons of corn and wheat are turned into feed for chickens and pigs and cattle. So 7.56 times as much are pumped into this vastly inefficient system, where in a best case scenario, you're putting 9 calories in to get 1 calorie back out. And that doesn't even include the 85% of the global soy crop, another 200 million metric tons of feed that is turned in, another 200 million metric tons that is turned into animal feed. So you're actually talking about 100 million metric tons for biofuels, and more than 10 times that amount is turned into animal feed. And 90% of the caloric intake absolutely wasted, either burned off by the animals existing, or it goes into bones or feathers or blood, other things that human beings are not consuming. The World Watch Institute summed up the global issue this way. They said meat production is an inefficient use of grain. The grain is used more efficiently when consumed directly by humans. Continued growth in meat output is dependent on feeding grain to animals, creating competition for grain between affluent meat eaters and the global poor. Basically, each time we're consuming animal products, we're entering into this sort of mercenary relationship. We're not personally throwing away all that pasta, but we might as well be. That's the relationship that we're entering into. This is probably the world's largest banner. It's a Greenpeace banner. And this right here is multiple people. So, that's one person, that's a couple people. So it's a massive banner. It's in a massive soy crop in South America that used to be rainforests. And Greenpeace's point with this banner is A, that rainforests are being chopped down to be turned into soy to be fed to KFC chickens. Obviously, KFC isn't the only culpable party. The entire chicken industry and pork industry and beef industry, they're all doing this. But this was Greenpeace's original target. And then 2 is subsistence farmers and people who might otherwise have used land in South America to grow crops for their families and crops for local populations are tossed off of the land so that the multinational corporations can create basically crops for animal feed. And that's one of the things that animal agriculture contributes to. Oxfam summed it up this way. They said, eating less meat is a simple way to reduce the pressure on global resources and help ensure that everybody has enough to eat. To say it simply, eating less meat helps fight hunger. So that's point 1 in one of the big problems that a shift from animal agriculture helps us to address. The big food question, where are we going to find enough food to feed 9 billion people? Well, for starters, we should stop wasting the 90% of it that is wasted if we're cycling it through animal products. But it's not just the calories in, calories out equation that's problematic. There is the complementary issue of when you're doing something that inefficient, what are the other environmental consequences? And this issue also makes, I think, intuitive sense. So it's not the case, obviously, that plant-based foods require no resources and cause no pollution. So if you're tilling crops, that creates pollution and uses energy. When you're shipping those crops to the factory to turn them into, cocoa roux or some microbrew beer, two of the best plant-based foods in existence. That also requires energy and causes pollution. But the thing about animal agriculture is you still have to grow the crops, right? Except now you're shipping the crops to a feed mill, and you're operating the feed mill. And then you're shipping the feed to the factory farm, and you're operating the factory farm. And then you're shipping the animals to the slaughterhouse, and you're operating the slaughterhouse. So it's many extra stages of A, gas-guzzling, pollution-spewing vehicles, as well as multiple extra factories that both require a lot of energy and that spew out a lot of pollution. So once you crunch the numbers of the inefficiencies and the extra stages of production, you find that it takes about 20 times the fossil fuels, 14 times the water, and 25 times the land to get animal foods to the table as to get plant-based foods to the table. The United Nations released a 408-page report called Livestocks Long Shadow. And in Livestocks Long Shadow, they broke it all down, and they said that animal agriculture is one of the most significant contributors to the most serious environmental problems at every scale, from local to global. So no matter what environmental issue you're talking about, from the smallest to the largest, animal agriculture is one of the top 2 or 3 contributors to that problem. Specifically, animal agriculture contributes to problems of land degradation, climate change and air pollution, water shortage and water pollution, and loss of biodiversity. And for people who are environmentalists, what is the biggest issue that environmentalists are concerned about? Yeah, climate change. On climate change, animal agriculture creates about 40% more global warming than all forms of transport combined. So all of the SUVs, all of the 18-wheelers, all of the jumbo jets, all other sorts of travel combined, animal agriculture is responsible for about 18% of greenhouse gas creation, which is about 40% more than all forms of transportation combined. So specifically on the issue of global warming, legumes create, on a per-calorie basis, about 2 grams of carbon dioxide equivalent. Corn creates a little more than that. Wheat creates a little more than that. Poultry creates 54 grams, again, the least greenhouse gas causing of the meat industry. Pork a little bit more than that. Fish 3 times that. Beef twice fish. So again, focused on the most efficient animal product, you're talking about chicken, which causes on a per-calorie basis 10 times more CO2 equivalent than wheat, 14 times more than corn, and 27 times more than legumes, including soy. And for people who are most interested in protein calories specifically, the equation gets even worse. So it causes, per calorie of protein, 40 times more CO2 equivalent coming from chicken, the least CO2 producing meat, than would come from soy or legumes, which are generally the standard substitute in plant-based alternatives. When people are talking about global warming and the best thing for individuals to do, what are they generally, where do people generally focus when talking about how we can decrease our contribution to climate change? Light bulbs, what else? Cars, yeah, a whole bunch of people said cars. I think it's probably cars. It's like the thing that each of us as individuals, where we can most reduce our contribution, it's really wrong. It's animal product consumption. As an example of that, the Sierra Club pointed out that if you cut meat production by just meat consumption by just 20%, in other words, cut out 1/5 of what you're consuming, that would be the equivalent of moving from a sedan to a hybrid. Environmental Defense said if every American skipped just 1 meal of chicken per week and substituted vegetarian foods, the carbon dioxide equivalent savings would be the same as taking more than 500,000 cars off of US roads. And that's 1 meal of chicken per week. Just 1 meal per week over 52 weeks It's the equivalent of taking 500,000 cars off the roads. Of course, all of us have the power to do quite a bit more than that. A couple of years ago, the Royal Institute for International Affairs, which is the foremost, most influential think tank in Europe, it's oftentimes shorthanded as Chatham House, they said that without severe cuts in consumption, agricultural emissions will take up the entire world carbon budget by 2050. And that would mean that every other sector, including energy, industry, and transport, would have to be zero carbon. Obviously, energy, transport, and industry is not going to be zero carbon. But it is literally the case that governments will not be able to meet their obligations under the Paris Climate Agreement unless they address animal agriculture. It is a literal impossibility. Chatham House summed it up. Shifting global demand for meat and dairy products is central, not just central, but absolutely imperative to meeting climate goals. So those are the two big issues that we talk about and focus on at both the Good Food Institute, which is the nonprofit organization, as well as New Crop Capital, which is the venture capital fund. But it's worth briefly talking about these ancillary benefits that come along with it, human health and animal protection. So pretty much the entire scientific and health community, it is as accepted that meat consumption leads to diseases of affluence as it is accepted that human-made energy production is leading to climate change. It is just as accepted. It's complete unanimity among everybody in the health community and the scientific community. As just a couple of examples, the American Heart Association and recognized heart disease kills about half of Americans, a little more than half of men, a little less than half of women. They say a diet that emphasizes plant-based foods compared to animal-based foods can lower the risk of dying from heart disease and stroke by up to 20%. Cancer, the number 2 killer, the American Institute for Cancer Research says when it comes to American health, the research shows one thing very clearly. We all need to eat more plants, and we need to eat less meat. Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, a strong body of scientific evidence links excess meat consumption with heart disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes, obesity, certain cancers, and earlier death. And then finally, no bastion of pro-veg activism, the United States Department of Agriculture, and their dietary guidelines for Americans, a diet higher in plant-based foods and lower in animal-based foods is more health promoting. And in fact, just a couple of days ago, the National Academy of Sciences released an economic report in which they said if the global diet reduced animal product consumption by about 2/3 of what it is now, we would prevent 6% of premature deaths every single year. As you move to vegetarian, it goes to about 8.5%, and as you move to vegan, it goes to about 10%. So according to the National Academy of Sciences, there is a linear relationship between premature mortality and animal product consumption. So in addition to feeding the world and cutting back on climate change, perhaps prolonging the time of our species on Earth, we will also have a healthier and happier time while we're here, and so will animals. So the fourth thing to talk about is intensive animal agriculture is extraordinarily abusive for the animals involved. And this is, most people don't spend a lot of time thinking about animal product consumption, but it's worth noting that chickens and pigs, as just two examples, they actually outperform dogs and cats on tests of behavioral and cognitive sophistication, which is to say ethologists, the people who study animal behavior, cognition, and emotion, they say that chickens and pigs are more complex than the animals who all of us know a little bit better and understand to be complex. My wife insists that the cats are refusing to participate in the tests. The cats could wallop the chickens and pigs if they really wanted to, but the dogs are trying. There really is no moral or ethical difference between abusing a chicken or a cat, a pig or a dog. And yet, this is what a modern broiler shed looks like. They cram 30,000 to 50,000 chickens into these sheds. When they're babies, it doesn't look, it still looks pretty bad. But when they're babies, it looks like they have some space. At this point, it looks like sort of a carpet of chickens. So a chicken has a wingspan of about 30 to 32 inches. Each bird in these sheds gets about 9 by 9 for her or his entire life. And this graphic is from yesterday's Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal yesterday, right under the masthead, had a photo of a bird looking out at the 2 million people who subscribe to the print edition of the paper, and then a headline about the fact that chickens are growing so quickly now that a huge percentage of them, it's completely messing with their physiology, and it's making them less pleasant to eat. That's what the focus of the article is. But it's also extraordinarily unpleasant for the birds. And of these two charts, I think it's interesting that since the 30s, we've gone from chickens who are about 2.5 pounds to chickens who are 6.24 pounds. It takes them a third of the amount of time to get there. And what that means, as documented in the chart on the right, is that you're going from about 45 days per pound of bird to 7.7 days per pound of bird. A lot of that is genetic breeding. A lot of that is the heavy doses of antibiotics, growth-promoting antibiotics that cause the birds to become really top-heavy. Poultry scientists at the University of Arkansas, they said that if a human baby grew as quickly as a modern broiler chicken, she would weigh, by her 6-month birthday, she would weigh more than 600 pounds. Imagine a human baby at 6 months old clocking the scales at more than 600 pounds. These animals are in misery for their entire lives. Their hearts can't keep up, their lungs can't keep up, their limbs can't keep up. They really are. Their entire lives are unmitigated misery. So that's the fourth in our, whatever the 4 version of trifecta is, problems of animal agriculture. Does anybody know? Quadfecta. Doesn't sound as nice as trifecta. I should probably drop one of the issues just so that I can say trifecta. So at the Good Food Institute, we really do, we focus on all of the issues, but in terms of food technology and the venture capitalists that are jumping into this issue, the focus is on global hunger and the focus is on climate change. And that's sort of like where the money and the enthusiasm is. And it's a really good reason to start moving away from animal agriculture and toward plant-based agriculture. Historically, when nonprofit groups have been thinking about how do we address the myriad problems of animal agriculture, we have largely come down in favor of education. If we just tell enough people about what I was just talking about, people will, in droves, descend on their local Whole Foods and buy them out of garden burgers. Well, it hasn't actually happened that way. So the solution of the Good Food Institute and the solution of New Crop Capital is to focus on the things that actually motivate people's eating decisions. So when you go to the grocery store or order off a menu, how many people in this room think before you order or buy about how the food that you're about to buy tastes? Yeah, we all think about taste. How many people think about price? How many people look at the price? Yeah, we all think about price. And how many people, you may not think about convenience, but if it's not there, you're not buying it. If it's not on the menu, you're probably not going back into the kitchen yourself and seeing if they have something in the freezer that you like better than what is actually listed on the menu. So at the Good Food Institute, we are single-mindedly focused on making it easier for people to make decisions that align with the values that will be better for the climate, better for the global poor, better for consumer health, and better for animals. And I'm going to talk about 3 of the things that we're focused on. The first one is food technology. And that is basically using what has been used for decades to create the best possible or the tastiest or best-selling possible, microwave meals or, breakfast cereals or whatever else, like using the fact that there is an entire industry focused on food technology to create the best plant-based meats. And one example of that is this, which is the Beyond Meat Beast Burger. So people clearly want to eat hamburgers, but most people are eating animal products despite how they're produced rather than because of how they're produced. So we're working on creating plant-based versions of the things that people like that are cost competitive, equally tasty, and convenient. And that it means that we're also working with grocery stores, working with restaurants, working with food service to try to achieve maximum distribution for these sorts of products. Another thing we're working on is cultured animal products. And so what that means is you take the cells from a chicken or a pig or a cow or a fish, and you multiply the cells in a bioreactor, which is what a fermenter is, and out comes a burger. So instead of causing the cells to multiply by feeding the chicken or feeding the pig or feeding the cow, and the cells multiply as the animal gets bigger, here you're taking sugars and you're adding the sugars to the cells, and that causes the cells to multiply in a way that gets rid of 95% of the greenhouse gas contribution, and that is 3 times more efficient even than chicken. And that's what this looks like. It's the world's first cultured meatball, produced just a couple of months ago in San Francisco. Once it scales up, this is what it will look like. So beer brewing, fermenters are bioreactors, and bioreactors are also what will be used to make cultured meat. So one of the things that's great about both plant-based and cultured is that they can be completely transparent. So as probably many of you, who here has heard of ag-gag laws? Okay, about half of people. Ag-gag laws have been passed in 7 or 8 states at this point, and they've been proposed in more than 20 states. And what they do is they criminalize undercover investigations of animal farms and slaughterhouses. So they target the folks at the Humane Society of the United States and Mercy for Animals and PETA and ALDF, the people who want to show the world what's happening on farms and in slaughterhouses. It literally becomes a crime to tell the world what's happening. So plant-based meat and cultured meat could not be more diametrically the opposite of that. We envision a time in the future where just like you can go to your neighborhood sort of pub restaurant and you walk in and you see the fermenter there and you can order the beer that was created in that fermenter, the same sort of thing could be true for meat. But even the big sort of Anheuser-Busch's and Pabst Blue Ribbons of meat will still look like this. They will be transparent. The products coming out will be cleaner, will be safer, and far from criminalizing finding out about them, they'll be giving tours. And the third thing to talk about is cultured versions of eggs and dairy and gelatin. There are 3 companies that what they do is they take yeast and they inject the genes from egg proteins or dairy proteins or collagen, which is turned into gelatin. They inject the genes into the yeast, and then they feed the yeast, and the yeast grows actual egg proteins or dairy proteins or collagen proteins. So it's similar to what I was just talking about with regard to cultured meat, except that it doesn't even have to start with an animal. It starts with the yeast, you add the sugars, and instead of the yeast growing, instead the proteins from eggs or dairy or collagen grows. And that's exactly where more than 90%, that's not exactly, but that process is exactly where more than 90% of rennet comes from now. So anybody in here who eats cheese, the rennet in that cheese was produced in exactly the way that I just described. So up until the early 1990s, rennet came from calf stomachs, and so they scrape the stomach to get the rennet, and it would obviously be significantly more likely to have harmful bacteria, significantly more likely to have all kinds of other pathogens and adulterants. And now cheese can be made with 100% pure rennet because it's created through synthetic biology instead of being created in a calf's stomach. That's also, for anybody in here who knows people who have diabetes and have to inject insulin, that's where 100% of insulin now comes from. And consequently, it's significantly safer than insulin was 20 years ago when it was coming from pigs. We believe that this future for protein, this future disruptive technology for animal products, we agree with the guy who is the CEO of Pinnacle Foods. They recently bought Gardein Products, which is a plant-based meat company. They bought Gardein for $154 million. And the CEO said plant-based meats are in the early stages of a macro trend, similar to the way that soy and almond milk changed the milk category. So Pinnacle Foods is a multi-billion-dollar food company that sees plant-based meats as the future. These are the guys who are responsible for Hungry Man, and they're also the guys who are responsible for potted meat. And they are jumping in a big way into plant-based. And just to give you a sense of what this means, plant-based milks right now represent about 8% of the domestic milk market. So all milks, annual revenues are about $26.5 billion. Plant-based milks are responsible for about $2 billion every single year, which works out to about 8%. So Gamgord is saying that he thinks that plant-based meats are about to catch up. So it's worth looking at where plant-based meats are now. Plant-based meats are $500 million out of a $200 billion meat market, which for those of us who are a little far removed from our 7th grade math class, that's about 1/4%. So to close that gap would look like this. It would look like from about 1/4% to 8%. And Lux Research, which is a research company that looks especially at the food industry, they looked at the trends over the last 5 to 10 years, and their projection is that plant-based meats will be at 33%, at 1/3 of the domestic meat industry and the global meat industry by 2054, which is 140 times what it is now. In terms of dollar value, in terms of billions of dollars in the United States, that's $500 million on the left, that's now. We're looking at growing to dairy parity to about $16 billion, and then to Lux Research prediction, which I think is arguably conservative, we're looking at $66, $67 billion. And of course, that would be if the entire sector stayed stagnant. But basically, plant-based meats are about to kick the revenue crap out of animal-based meats. And it's started. These are a few of the companies that are playing in the plant-based alternatives to animal agriculture space. And Mintel Research, which also is a food industry-focused research firm, pointed out that almost 1/3 of millennials indicate that they consume plant-based meats daily, with 70% of them consuming them a few times a week. Obviously, even more successful than plant-based meats is plant-based dairy products, so things like silk soy milk and Daiya. And those folks in the vegan community were especially delighted a couple of months ago when Ben & Jerry's jumped back into the plant-based dairy category with 4 really spectacular plant-based dairy options: the fudge brownie, PB&, cookie, chunky monkey, and coffee caramel fudge. And I'm hoping that they will be creating one based on Matt's dedication to plant-based ice creams. So they need to name it after Matt. I'm hoping. In the startup category, Beyond Meat, Hampton Creek, and Impossible. These are three companies that didn't exist 5 years ago. And over the last 5 years, they've raised from venture capitalists about $400 million. And they have a valuation across those three companies of about $2 billion. Plant-based cheese is also playing along. Miyoko's Creamery and Kite Hill, which have raised, I'm not sure what their valuation is, but they've raised between them over $10 million just in the last few years. The very first cultured meat company is called Memphis Meats. It was formed about 8 months ago. And there's an accelerator in San Francisco called IndieBio. It's run by a venture capital firm called SOS Ventures. And what they do with this accelerator is they take companies that are interested in using synthetic biology in disruptive ways, and they put them through what's called an accelerator. So they basically, in 4 months, they advance the business the equivalent of a couple of years. And at the end of it, they do something called Demo Day, and people stand up and they present their idea to a room full of investors. And they had 15 companies go through their last crop, and they presented on February 4th. And by the time they presented, the idea of Demo Day is that investors will be there and they will want to invest in you on the basis of what you say, and then they'll meet with you. Well, 2 companies had already closed their round. One of them was Memphis Meats, and they had already, by that point, raised $2.75 million. And they didn't want any more money until they moved to Series A, which is likely to happen at the end of this year. So venture capitalists are very excited about what they're doing with cultured meat. The cultured egg, dairy, and collagen companies have raised between them about $15 million. All 3 of them had no trouble closing their seed. Clara and Mufri, which are a couple years old, also had no trouble closing their Series A. Gelzen is in the period between seed and Series A, but venture capitalists very excited about what they're doing. So people like these guys. Bill Gates on the left, when he tried Beyond Meat, he said, what I was experiencing was more than a clever meat substitute. It was a taste of the future of food. The guy on the right is Sergey Brin, one of the co-founders of Google. He put the first roughly $1 million into cultured meat before it was even a company. So as part of his philanthropic portfolio, he put $1 million into advancing the idea of culturing meat through a researcher at Maastricht University in the Netherlands called Mark Post. Similarly, really big venture capital firms like Kleiner Perkins, Khosla, SOS Ventures, Obvious. Obvious is the Twitter founders, Ev Williams and Biz Stone. Horizon Ventures, which is the VC firm of Li Ka-shing, who's the richest person in Asia. All of these companies excited about the idea of the space that we're discussing. So plant-based dairy, plant-based meat, and cultured dairy. A place that I wouldn't have expected this sort of excitement. A couple months ago, got this industry journal, said meat producers could do worse in the 21st century than to cozy up like smart investors like Bill Gates. Gates and these other investors see protein production less as an agricultural issue and more as a technology issue. So the food technology we've been talking about. Taking a page from that playbook could put some meat companies far ahead of others in the competition for today's consumer dollar. This was the January 2016 issue of Meeting Place magazine, and it was the opening letter from the editor of the magazine. So Lisa Keefe, the title of her letter to readers of Meeting Place just a couple months ago was titled Hormel's Next Acquisition. And she was talking about Hormel and Tyson and Smithfield and other meat companies recognizing that the future of consumer demand is plant-based and it's cultured. And she was suggesting that they put R&D dollars into these food technologies and also acquisition dollars into buying companies like Modern Meadow and Beyond Meat. Bill Gates sums it up. He says, so far we've only explored about 8% of the world's plant proteins as potential meat alternatives. Remaking meat is one sector of the food industry that is ripe for innovation and growth. So moving toward close, the thing that I want to impress upon everybody, and one of the big focal points of the Good Food Institute, is talking to people who are already interested in the food industry, but might otherwise have been looking to develop the next red dye number, 276, or the next, super crunchy cornflakes, or whatever in food, or people who understand synthetic biology and we're going to be going into the medical space, or doing something else with their expertise. People who are entrepreneurial, and one of the reasons I was excited, to have the business school and the innovation center co-sponsor this speech is one of the things we really want to do is communicate the capacity to both do good in these areas and do well by using your expertise to either start more companies like this, because we need more. There's one at the moment viable cultured meat company, one viable cultured dairy company, one viable cultured egg company, one viable cultured gelatin company, and not nearly enough plant-based meat and dairy companies to meet the demand that's about to explode. So my suggestion to you as you think about a career path is that you think about the fact that even if you're not interested in food science or synthetic biology or entrepreneurship, there are going to be more and more jobs at these companies, and they need committed, passionate people who want to make the world a better place, and the salary structure will probably be quite good. As a place to start, I recommend our website, which is thegoodfoodinstitute.org. Here in the upper right-hand corner, you will see a resources page. If you click on it, you will see this, and there are academic lab opportunities, academic papers, job opportunities. If you want to learn more about it, you can read the select popular media, or if you want to get more in-depth, you can read 2 buttons up, the academic papers, startup funding opportunities, which is one of the things that we're doing at New Crop Capital, and then a video gallery for people who learn better by watching and listening, some videos that talk about all of these issues. I am absolutely convinced that just like nobody in this room, if you wanted to go to Washington, D.C. or San Francisco, anybody here going to run out and hop on a horse, or get in a horse and buggy, for the long trek? No, of course not. You will either drive, or you will fly, or you will take the train, because modern technology has made the idea of the horse and buggy obsolete. I'm convinced that we're going to get to exactly the same place with animal agriculture, because we simply cannot feed 9 billion people with the inefficiencies that animal agriculture brings, and we cannot solve the climate change problem with the pollution and the inefficiencies that animal agriculture brings. I also think that especially as we move in this direction and produce more and more of these products that are more convenient, tastier, and cheaper, people will realize the degree to which making these choices better aligns with their desire to lead healthy lives and better aligns with their desires not to harm animals unnecessarily. And I invite all of you to join the Good Food Institute, New Crop Capital, and all of these forward-thinking, innovative companies, as well as these venture capitalists in the plant-based and cultured future of protein. Thank you.